Thank you very much. And thanks, Athar, again for this invitation and for this presentation. It's great to be again here talking with you. So I would like to pick up on what we were discussing also last time, which is this notion of ideology, which I think is very important, and in order to ground your work, but also to understand its possibilities, future developments, and so on, coming from more of a curatorial perspective, right? Which is what I cultivate. So last time we were already mentioning how early on in your dissertation, somewhat you posed this question, no, whether it's possible to produce, to develop statues, monuments, artworks, I would say, perhaps, that can really survive in a way time, the test of time, and in sort of in relation to the ideologies that they carry, right? This double relationship of what a statue, what a monument, what an artwork represents, what it abides by, and somewhat which ideologies carries within itself, and how to articulate this relationship. So further on, though, you include in your thesis a very interesting statement when still thinking about this notion of ideology, because in an interview you state that in your work you don't include references to time, or at least very few. And you say, and I quote, "No clothes, no objects, just the naked body." But my observation here was that, of course, the body is also subject to politics and to ideologies, and that these change quite significantly over time. So I wanted to ask you again whether you could explain further how you've been thinking throughout the process of writing this dissertation, and maybe where you are now in this process of thinking about the relationship between representation, time, and ideology. So how are you working through this concern of not producing work that is inherently ideological, or if it is, how you're working with this notion of time, and how this could result either obsolete or unethical 60 years further down the road, or all the complications that we, for instance, see now when looking, for instance, at the avant-gardes of the early 20th century, right? So how do you negotiate this relationship, since you're so interested in this notion of ideology? And does the representation of just the naked body, as you said in your thesis, provide a solid escape route somewhat, or a solution to this dilemma in a way?
Mm-hmm. Ilaria, thank you very much for this question. I'll have to break it down in a couple of points, but you are absolutely right. First of all, let's specify that the representation of a naked body, as we are used to it in sculpture, is totally currently quite wrong. You know, we have white marble, white pure marble, and something tells us that that is better than others, but there is no really way that we can measure that. But yes, you know, the question of ideology and what one can do, because as a sculptor, we have witnessed the destruction of many monuments very recently, because these monuments were representing a specific ideology. So you could say that because they were speaking for one identity and not another, that's why they were destroyed. And also now we have the contemporary discussion here in the West to take down monuments that are very controversial. But of course, when these monuments were made, the people who made them did them with the best intentions. Again, they didn't know that they were portraying controversial figures. So my question is somewhat trying to look into the future and think of, how can I know what I'm doing now will not be offensive to future generations? I don't think there is a way of knowing that. We can try to be careful, but it becomes almost paralyzing, right? because we don't know what will happen. Maybe I'm portraying now white virile men figures that might be perceived as offensive in a couple of years. So I think, and I speak to this in my dissertation as well, about having a small identity, meaning not trying to attach yourself to one specific identity. Don't choose a specific religion or political beliefs. This gives you space, might be problematic, although, but it gives you space to move um, and adapt to changing situations, right? And speaking of naked bodies, I think that there might be an element that might save those statues from the iconoclast wave. For example, let's take the David of Michelangelo. Okay, it's a naked boy who has a slingshot in his hands, and well, it's King David, so it's representing the Israel fight for freedom. But it's a naked boy, and there are no other attributes that might identify it with Judaism and Israel. And nowadays, naked boys throwing stones at a stronger power, at a military power, we are seeing exactly the opposite, right? So in that sense, we could also, the lack of feature of the David of Michelangelo permits us to reinterpret it as representing something else. Of course, I know the implications of what I'm saying, but I hope you understand. So it's a problem that I'm faced with, but I think abstraction might be a way to go through, because it doesn't really give the possibility to attack something, right? And this is something that we have seen also when previous powers didn't destroy monuments of other cultures, but they appropriated them because they weren't so representative. So they said, okay, that stone is a holy stone for them, but then we appropriate it. We don't destroy it, and then the holy powers or what it stands for will benefit us as well.
Thanks. So, okay, interesting answer. I guess I see also a distinction between the examples you bring forward between something that can be reinterpreted over time because its lack of very specific connotations. The example of David, which I think is quite interesting, were as opposed to the monument of settlers and colonialists who conducted, murders and genocide across entire continents. And I think that comes down to also the set of power relations that are represented, and sort of might not necessarily have to survive the test of time through the ability to be reappropriated, but somewhat perhaps to survive the test of time in terms of what kind of power relations it reinforces or puts into critical rethinking. This is just as a side note that I hope might stay with you when thinking about sort of further developments of your work. And this also thinking about how to critically assess or reassess power relations through work brings me to the other question that I had for you, which is something I'm very interested in, which is the closing of your dissertation, because you develop somewhat this reflection and this parallel between sculpting and extraction as processes, but also as politics somewhat. And what I already mentioned to you, I was interested very much in, is that on the one hand, you articulate this inherent relationship between the positive space that you develop through the sculpting, or sort of this process that happens in the fullness of shape, and the violence that somewhat takes place in this emptying, of mining, and also of taking of resources, which is similar to the stone extraction that you were referring to, but with much heavier and completely different implications. And so this relationship that you articulate through these collages somewhat, I thought to be very interesting. And because, again, we're talking about power relations here, I wanted to ask you, how you've been working through these two notions, bringing together these parallel images that have such different connotations in terms of power, subjugation, and so on and so forth. And really also how, whether, because also in light of the work you've been doing in contexts such as Palestine or Lubumbashi and so on, also how you've been thinking not only about the power relations through these new collages, through this new type of work that you're developing, but also how you're thinking about the question of representation of white privileged bodies versus non-white exploited ones, and how you are finding an ethical balance in this process somewhat.
Yes, so I assume that you are referring to the last collages that I did as a result of my residency in the DRC last year. Just for the public, I did some collages where I placed mine workers, artisanal mine workers of Congolese mines with images of sculptors at work, but also of Michelangelo's prisoners or slaves, depending on how we want to call them. So that is, it's a double thing. So first of all, it was a reflection on the craft of sculpting. What is sculpting? You know, I'm trying to find answers about what is sculpture and what is sculpting, and being confronted with the harsh reality of artisanal mining in Congo, the DRC, I realized that what these people were doing was exactly the same thing as to what I am doing in my studio from the outside, of course. So what we are doing is we are using a hammer and a chisel, both them and I, or the sculptors, and carving into a rock, right? So of course we are privileged and they are slaves, basically, but the visual is the same, and that triggers some reflection about what it means to do what we do. And of course, both practices, although in a very different way, are related to extraction. And that questions also values of economy and the artwork, because, you know, sculpture is usually characterized or defined by extracting the figure, right? As we said before, extracting this figure within the block of stone. And this figure then goes on to have a specific value in the conceptual world or the art market, an economical value actually, but also a ideological, philosophical value. It stands for something. But then in the mining world, these people are also basically, with the same tool, extracting something else. They're extracting metals, minerals, diamonds, things that have also a value in another world, but they are much more easily related with issues of politics. Of course, we are more aware of what it means to extract copper or diamonds, blood diamonds. So, you know, they're very related to politics, but what is then the extraction of a sculpture? So that's on one side. And the other one was about juxtaposing the workers, the mine workers in the DRC with Michelangelo's prisoners. And that was more to, first of all, again, I saw the resemblance from the outside. And that was to question, what is the role of a sculptor in today's society? What I do, does it make sense, you know, spending hours, days, months in a studio carving on a rock while we are witnessing all the violence and the injustice that are happening in the world? Michelangelo says that the task of the sculptor is to free the prisoner of the stone, the prisoner that is embedded within the stone. But then I go to the DRC and I see literally these prisoners, these mine workers, which are imprisoned in a system, but also figuratively imprisoned in the mines, in the rock that they are mining. And the resemblance was so striking to me that I wanted to use it to provoke myself and ask myself, what am I doing? Is this the task of the sculptor, to free the slave? Then do I have also the responsibility or the duty to do something to free those slaves and symbolically to change, to contribute to a change in the world? Or are we here just to make beautiful sculptures to embellish people's gardens, right?
So do you have the duty?
I have that duty. I think I do. I don't want to fall under the category of embellishments and decoration. Of course, I think that I have a duty, as we all do. Perhaps I didn't find yet the way of how to do that, but there is definitely the questioning and the struggle of trying to make sense of what we do, what I do, and try to place it in today's society and give it a more relevance. This is, I think, one of the aims of this research, was questioning what does stone mean, what does sculpture mean, and how can I navigate the world and contribute somehow to it.
Thank you.